Oh, well, I heard myself. Okay. Let's see how well Stream Elements does the job. Oh, I'm muted. Okay. I'm going to hit that add button before anyone really gets on here. Because I can. Come on. Where my head's going? I don't know. It says it's running. Phenomena. Boop boo doo doo doo. Phenomena. Do 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 do. Phenomena. Do 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 do. Phenomena. Do 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 do. Do 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 wee bop bop. Wee bop wee bop wee bop bop. Ba up. Boom. 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 Boom, 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 boom. How low can I get my voice? I do not know how it sounds all to you. I get no kicks from champagne, beer, alcohol doesn't thrill me at all. But baby, can it be true that I get a belt out of you? Some get their kicks from cocaine. Okay. Yeah, I should really stop singing. But I'm not likely to. What I will do is see if my sound alerts are working with the dam, because I am tired of them not working. The audio is turned on for them, so there's no reason why they shouldn't. And, well, everything else seems to be working. Sound alerts, are you there? Hello? And that would be a no. I hear no sound alerts. I'm really tired of that not working. I really wish I could find out why they weren't working, because it is annoying as hell. Hey, Red Wolf, how you doing? Let's see. Thunder? Thunder? blurb working? I'm not hearing anything blurb. I don't know what's going on with those. I really do wish my sound alerts would work, because it's annoying when they don't. Refresh both of them and nothing. I'm beginning to wonder why I even have them. I heard part of the thunder eventually. Will jump scare work? Maybe. Jump scare, are you there? Jump scare? Anyone? Anyone? I didn't even see the alert for it. Saw the alert in chat. I did not see it pop up on screen. Yo! Thank you for the gift subs. Whoever they are. Yay, gift subs. Cool. Thank you, anonymous visitor, whoever you are. Oh! Okay, jump scare had a serious delay on it. Okay, let's see. It's 9:05, so not quite time to get into the storybook time. So, how's everyone doing? Having a good week? Glad it's over. Wow, I did not know how much of a delay I have between when I actually say something and when it pops up on stream. Or if I'm just hearing myself echoing really badly, one or the other. Let's see. Someday my sound alerts will work. Will this one come up? Come on, hon. I want to hear your voice. Oh, Sam just went live. Do I honestly have a 2-minute delay? I said it was 9:05 2 minutes ago and just looked at my clock and it says 9:07. I did not have a delay on. What the hell? That is a drastic delay time. It was a very long week, Nolan. Oh, and now OBS is trying to freeze on me. Lovely, lovely. Let's see. Come on, OBS. Don't give me that not responding stuff. Come on. I guess as long as the stream doesn't completely die, I guess we're good. Okay, yay, OBS came back to me. Why do I have such... All my settings have changed on it. What the hell? I do not have any delays turned on OBS at all. What the heck? Anyway, that's 9:09, so let's go ahead and get over to the reading screen. Because we are doing fairy tales. Because it's Friday night. Oh, well, as long as I'm a pro streamer. Yeah, pro game here. Still kind of curious why I have such a really weird delay, though. But, oh well. If it's working, and we're good. And my clock says it is 9:09, so we're almost there. The book has been opened. And I'm going to have to mute another window because I heard gunshots and it's kind of triggering me a little. Excuse me. And now I seem to have cats fighting at my front door. Cats. They be cats. Anyway, it is 9:10, so it is time to start reading. So, oh yeah. I feed strays, so I've got the food outside my door, but my indoor cats watch through the storm door, so luckily a cat fight with a force field between them. It gets weird sometimes. But anyway, first story tonight, The Robber Bridegroom, from Grimm's Complete Fairy Tales. And my phone's making noises at me. Thought I had that turned off. Oh no, well. Anyway, The Robber Bridegroom, from Grimm's Fairy Tales. There was once on a time a miller who had a beautiful daughter, and she was grown up. He wished that she was provided for and well married. Though, if any good suitor comes and asks for her, I will give her to him. Not long afterwards, a suitor came, who appeared to be very rich, and as the miller had no fault to find in him, he promised his daughter to him. The maiden, however, did not like him quite so much as a girl should like a man to whom she was engaged, and she had no confidence in him. Whenever she saw him or thought of him, she felt a secret horror. Once he said to her, "Thou art my betrothed, and thou hast never once paid me a visit." The maiden replied, "I know not where thy house is." Then the bridegroom, "My house is out there, in the dark forest." She tried to excuse herself, and she said she could not find her way there. The bridegroom said, "Next Sunday thou must come out there to me. I have already invited the guests, and I will strew ashes in order that thou mayest find thy way through the forest." When Sunday came, and the maidens had set out on her way, she became very uneasy. She herself knew not exactly why, and to where her mark may well be fueled, with both her pockets full of peas and lentils. The ashes were strewn at the entrance of the forest, and these she followed. But at every step she threw a few peas on the ground. She walked almost the whole day until she reached the middle of the forest, where it was the darkest, and there stood a solitary house, which she did not like, for it looked so dark and dismal. She went inside it, but no one was within, and the most absolute stillness reigned. Suddenly a voice cried, turn back, young maiden dear! 'Tis a murderer's house you enter here!" The maiden looked up, and saw that the voice came from a bird, which was hanging in a cage on the wall. Again it cried, turn back, young maiden dear! 'Tis a murderer's house you enter here!" Then the young maiden went on farther from room to room, and walked through the whole house. But it was entirely empty, and not one human being was to be found. At last she came to the cellar, and there sat an extremely aged woman who shook her head constantly. "Can you tell me," said the maiden, "if my betrothed lives here?" "Alas, poor child," replied the old woman, "whither hast thou come? Thou art in a murderer's den. Thou thinkest thou art a bride soon to be married, but thou wilt keep thy wedding with death. Look, I have been forced to put on the great kettle on there, with the water in it, and when they have thee in their power, they will cut 3 pieces without mercy, cook thee, and eat thee, for they are the eaters of human flesh. If I do not have compassion on thee and save thee, thou art lost." Thereupon the old woman led her behind the great hogshead, where she could not be seen. "Be still as a mouse," said she. "Do not make a sound or move, or all will be over with thee. At night, when the robbers are asleep, we will escape. I have long waited for an opportunity." Hardly was this done than the godless crew came home. They dragged with them another young girl. They were drunk, and paid no heed to her screams and lamentations. They gave her wine to drink, 3 glasses full, 1 glass of white wine, 1 glass of red, and a glass of yellow. With this her heart burst in twain. Thereupon they tore off her delicate raiment, laid her on a table, and cut her beautiful body in pieces, and strewed salt thereon. She needed salt. The poor bride behind the cask trembled and shook, for she saw right well what fate the robbers had destined for her. One of them noticed a gold ring on the little finger of the murdered girl, and as it would not come off at once, he took an axe and cut off the finger. But it sprang up in the air and ran away to the cask, and fell straight into the bride's bosom. The robber took a candle and wanted to look for it, but could not find it. Another of them said, Hast thou looked behind the great hogshead? But the old woman cried,
Come and get something to eat, and leave off looking till the morning. The finger won't run away from you.
Then the robber said, The old woman is right, and gave up their search and sat down to eat. And the old woman poured a sleeping draught into their wine, so that they soon lay down in the cellar and slept and snored. When the bride heard that, she came out from behind the hogshead, and had to step over the sleepers, for they lay in rows on the ground, and great was her terror lest she should waken even one of them. But God helped her, and she got safely over. The old woman went up with her, opened the doors, and they hurried out of the murderer's den with all the speed in their power. The wind had blown away the strewn ashes, but the peas and lentils had sprouted and grown up, and showed them the way in the moonlight. They walked the whole night until in the morning they arrived at the mill, and then the maiden told her father everything exactly as it had happened. When the day came when the wedding was to be celebrated, the bridegroom appeared, and the miller had invited all his relations and friends. As they sat at the table, each was bidden to relate something. The bride sat still and said nothing. Then the bridegroom said to the bride, Come, my darling, dost thou know nothing? Relate something to us like the rest. She replied,
Then I will relate a dream. I was walking alone through the wood, and at last I came to a house in which no living soul was. But on the wall there was a bird in a cage, which cried, turn back, here, maiden dear. 'Tis a murderer's house you enter here. And then it cried once more, my darling, I only dreamt this. Then I went through all the rooms, and they were all empty, and there was something so horrible about them. At last I went down into the cellar, and there sat a very old woman whose head shook. I asked her, Does my bridegroom live in this house? She answered, Alas, poor child, thou hast got into a murderer's den. Thy bridegroom does live here, and he will hew thee to pieces and kill thee, and then he will cook thee and eat thee. My darling, I only dreamt this, but the old woman hid me behind the great hogshead, and scarcely I was hidden. When the robbers came home, dragging a maiden with them, to whom they gave 3 kinds of wine to drink, white, red, and yellow, which her heart broke into twain. My darling, I only dreamt this, and one of the robbers saw that there was still a ring on her little finger, and it was hard to draw off. He took an axe and cut it off. But the finger sprang up into the air, and sprang behind a great hogshead, and fell in my bosom. And there's the finger with the ring.
And with these words she drew it forth, and showed it to those present. The robber, who had during the story become as pale as ashes, leapt up and wanted to escape, but the guests held him fast, and delivered him over to justice. Then he and his whole troop were executed for their infamous deeds. The house is still there. I've been there a few times. They left stew on. It was overcooked. Anyway. Anywho. Yes. our next wonderful story for the evening. Lovely Ilonka from the Crimson Fairy Book. There once was a king's son who told his father that he wished to marry. "No, no," said the king. "You must not be in such a hurry. Wait till you have done some great deed. My father did not let me marry until I had won the golden sword you see me wear." The prince was much disappointed, and he never dreamed of disobeying his father, and he began to think with all his might what he could do. It was no use staying at home, so one day he wandered out into the world to try his luck. And as he walked along, he came to a little hut in which he found an old woman crouching over a fire. "Good evening, mother. I see you have lived long in this world. Do you know anything about the three bulrushes?" Bulrushes.
Yes, indeed. I lived long and been much about in the world, but I have never seen or heard anything of what you ask. Still, if you will wait till tomorrow, I may be able to tell you something.
Well, he waited till the morning, and quite early the old woman appeared and took out a little pipe and blew into it. And in a moment, all the crows in the world were flying to her. Not one was missing. That's a lot of crows. Then she asked if they knew anything about the three bulrushes, but not one of them did. The prince went on his way, and a little further on he found another hut, in which lived an old man. On being questioned, the old man said he knew nothing, but begged the prince to stay overnight. And the next morning the old man called all the ravens together, but they too had nothing to tell. The prince bade him farewell and set out. He wandered so far that he crossed 7 kingdoms. 7 of them. And at last, one evening, he came to a little house in which was an old woman. "Good evening, dear mother," he said politely.
Good evening to you, my dear son,"
answered the old woman.
"It is lucky for you that you spoke to me, or you would have met a horrible death. But may I ask where you are going?"
"I am seeking the 3 bulrushes. Do you know anything about them?"
"I don't know anything myself, but wait till tomorrow. Perhaps I can tell you then."
So the next morning she blew on her pipe, and lo and behold, every magpie in the world flew up. That is to say, all the magpies except one, who had a broken leg and a wing. The old woman sent after it at once, and when she questioned the magpies, the crippled one was the only one who knew where the 3 bulrushes were. Then the prince started off with the lame magpie. They went on till they reached a great stone wall, many, many feet high.
"Prince,"
said the magpie,
"the 3 bulrushes are behind that wall."
The prince wasted no time. He set his horse at the wall and leaped over it. Then he looked about for the 3 bulrushes, piled them up, and set off with them on his way home. As he rode along, one of the bulrushes happened to knock against something. It split open, and only sprang out a lovely girl, who said,
My heart's love, you are mine, and I am yours. Do give me a glass of water.
But how could the prince give it to her when there was no water in? So the lovely maiden flew away. He split the second bulrush as an experiment, and just the same thing happened. How careful he was of the third bulrush. He waited till he came to a well, and there he split it open, and out sprang a maiden 7 times lovelier than either of the other two. And she too said,
My heart's love, I am yours, and you are mine. Do give me a glass of water.
This time the water was ready, and the girl did not fly away. But she and the prince promised to love each other always. Get a girl a drink. Then they set out for home. They soon reached the prince's country, and as he wished to bring his promised bride back in a fine coach, he went on to the town to fetch one, in the field where the well was. The king's swineherds and cowherds were feeding their droves, and the prince left Ilonka, for that was her name, should have mentioned that earlier, in their care. Unluckily, the chief swineherd had an ugly old daughter, and whilst the prince was away, he dressed her up in fine clothes, and threw Ilonka into the well. Yeah. The prince returned before long, bringing with him his father and mother, and a great train of courtiers to escort Ilonka home. But how they all stared when they saw the swineherd's ugly daughter. Yikes. However, there was nothing for it but to take her home. And, 2 days later, the prince married her, and his father gave up the crown to him. Am I reading this right? But he had no peace. He knew very well that he had been cheated, though he did not think how. Once he desired to have some water brought him from the well in which Ilonka had been thrown. The coachman went for it, and he pulled up the bucket, and a pretty little duck, was swimming in it. He looked wonderingly at it, and all of a sudden it disappeared, and he found a dirty-looking girl standing before him. The girl returned with him, and managed to get a place in the house as a housemaid in the palace. Of course, she was very busy all day long, and whenever she had a little spare time, she sat down to spin. Her distaff turned off itself, and her spindle span by itself, and the flax wound itself off. And however much she might use, there was always plenty left. When the queen, or rather Swineherd's daughter, heard of this, she was very much wished to have the distaff, but the girl flatly refused to give it to her. However, at last she consented, on condition that she might sleep one night in the king's room. The queen was understandably very angry, and scolded her well, but as she longed to have the distaff, she consented, though she gave the king a sleeping draught at supper. Then the girl went to the king's room looking 7 times lovelier than ever. She bent over the sleeper and said,
My heart's love, I am yours, and you are mine. Speak to me but once, I am your Ilonka.
But the king was so sound asleep, he neither heard nor spoke, and Ilonka left the room, sadly thinking he was ashamed to own her. Soon after, the queen again sent to say that she wanted to buy a spindle. The girl agreed to let her have it on the same conditions as before. But this time, also, the queen took care to give the king a sleeping draught. And once more, Ilonka went to the king's room and spoke to him. Whisper as sweetly as she might, she could get no answer. Now, mind you, the king had some servants, and they had taken note of the matter, and warned their master not to eat or drink anything that the queen offered him. As for 2 nights running, she had given him a sleeping draught. The queen had no idea that her doings had been discovered, and when, a few days later, she wanted the flax, and had to pay the same price for it, she felt no fears at all. At supper that night, the queen offered the king all sorts of nice things to eat and drink, but he declared he was not hungry and went to bed early. The queen repented bitterly her promise to the girl, but it was too late to recall it, for Ilonka had already entered the king's room, where he lay anxiously waiting for something, he knew not what. All of a sudden he saw a lovely maiden bent over him and said,
"My dearest love, I am yours, you are mine. Speak to me, for I am your Ilonka."
At these words the king's heart bounded within him. He sprang up and embraced and kissed her, and she told him all her adventures since the moment he had left her. And when he heard that Ilonka had suffered, and how he had been deceived, he vowed he would be revenged. So he gave orders that the swineherd, his wife, and daughter should all be hanged. And so they were. The next day the king was married, with great rejoicings, to the fair Ilonka, and if they're not dead yet, why, they're still alive and living happily. Yeah. Is she a witch? Does she wear the same as a duck? She was floating in a well. She was a wool thrush first. Oh well. Oh, I love these stories, honestly. Of course, the next one is, of course, The Swineherd, from the Yellow Fairy Book. There once was a poor prince. He possessed a kingdom which, though was small, was yet large enough for him to marry on, and married he wished to be. Now it was certainly a little audacious of him to venture to say that he wanted the emperor's daughter. "Will you marry me?" But he did not venture to say so, for his name was known far and wide. There were hundreds of princesses who would gladly have said yes. But would she say the same? Well, we'll find out. On the grave of the prince's father grew a rose tree, a very beautiful rose tree. It only bloomed every 5 years, and then bore but a single rose. But no, such a rose! Its scent was so sweet that when you smelt it, you forgot all your cares and troubles. And he also had a nightingale, which could sing as if all the beautiful melodies in the world were shut up in its tiny little throat. This rose and this nightingale the princess was to have, and so they were both put into silver caskets and sent to her. The emperor had thought them
to him in the great hall, where the princess was playing. Here comes a duke a-riding, that's the name of the game, with all her ladies in waiting. But when she caught sight of the big caskets which contained the presents, she clapped her hands with joy. "If only it were a little pussycat," she said. But the rose tree with the beautiful rose came out. "But how pretty it's made," all the ladies in waiting said.
"It is more than pretty," said the emperor. "It is charming."
But the princess felt it, and then she almost began to cry. "Papa," she said, "it is not artificial. It is real." Said all the ladies in waiting. "It is real." Princesses yell.
"Let us see what is in the other caskets before we begin to be angry," thought the emperor.
And there came out a nightingale. It sang so beautifully that one could scarcely utter a crossword against it. That's, of course, your princess. "Superbe, charmant," said the ladies in waiting, for they all chattered French, each one worse than the others, and probably all worse than me. "How much the bird reminds me of a beautiful snuff-box out of the late empress," said the old courtier. "Ah, yes, it is the same tone, the same execution."
"Yes,"
said the emperor, and then he wept like a little child. "I hope that this, at least, is not real," said the princess.
"Yes, it is a real bird," said those who had brought it.
"Then let it fly away," said the princess, and she would not on any account allow the prince to come.
But he was nothing daunted. He painted on his brown face and black, and drew his cap over his face, and knocked on the door.
"Good day, emperor," he said. "Can I get a place here as a servant in the castle?"
"Yes," said the emperor, "but there are so many who ask for a place that I don't know whether there will be one for you. But still, I will think of you. Stay. It has just occurred to me that I want someone to look after the swine, for I have so very many of them."
And the prince got the station of Imperial Swineherd. He had a wretched little room close to the pigsties. Here he had to stay. But the whole day he sat working, and when evening was come he made a pretty little pot. All around it were bells, and when the pot boiled they jingled most beautifully, and played the old tune. "Where is Augustus, dear? Alas, he's not here. But the most wonderful thing was that when he held one finger in the steam of the pot, and then at once he could smell what dinner was ready in any fireplace in town. That was indeed something quite different from a rose. Now the princess came walking past with all her ladies in waiting, and she heard the tune, and she stood, and her face beamed with joy, for she could also play "Where is Augustus, dear?" It was the only tune she knew, but she could play it with one finger. "Why, that is what I play," she said. "It must be a most accomplished swineherd. Listen, go down and ask him what the instrument costs." And one of the ladies in waiting had to go down, but she put on wooden clogs. "What will you take for the pot?" asked the lady in waiting. "I will have 10 kisses from the princess," answered the swineherd. heaven forbid, said the lady-in-waiting. Yes, I will sell it for nothing less, replied the swineherd. Well, what does he say? Asked the princess. I really hardly like to tell you, answered the lady-in-waiting. Oh, then you can whisper to me. He is disobliging, said the princess, and went away. But she had only gone a few steps when the bells rang out so prettily. Where is Augustus, dear? Alas, he's not here, here. Listen, said the princess. Ask him whether he will take 10 kisses from my ladies-in-waiting. No, thank you, said the swineherd. 10 kisses from the princess, or else I keep my pot. That is very tiresome, said the princess. But you must put yourselves in front of me so that no one can see. And the ladies-in-waiting placed themselves in front and then spread out their dresses. So the swineherd got his 10 kisses, and she got the pot. What happiness that was! The whole night and the whole day the pot was made to boil. There was not a fireplace in the whole town where they did not know what was being cooked, whether it was at the chancellor's or the shoemaker's. The ladies-in-waiting danced and clapped their hands. We know who is having soup and pancakes. We know who is going to have porridge and sausages. Isn't it interesting? Yes, very interesting, said the first lady-in-waiting. Don't say anything about it, for I am the emperor's daughter. Oh, no, of course we won't, said everyone. The swineherd, that is to say, the prince, though they did not know he was anything but a true swineherd, let no day pass without making something. And one day he made a rattle which, when it was turned around, played all the waltzes, gallops, and polkas which had ever been known since the world began. That's a lot of polkas. Oh, but that is superb, said the princess as she passed by. I never heard anything more beautiful composition. Listen, go down and ask him what the instrument costs, but I won't kiss him again. He wants 100 kisses from the princess, said the lady-in-waiting, who had gone down to ask him. I believe he is mad, said the princess, and then she went on, but she had only gone a few steps when she stopped. One ought to encourage art, she said. I am the emperor's daughter. Tell him he shall have, as before, 10 kisses. The rest he can take from any of my ladies-in-waiting. But we don't all like kissing him, then, said the ladies-in-waiting. That's nonsense, said the princess. If I can kiss him, you can too. Besides, remember that I will give you board and lodging. 100 kisses from the princess, said he, for each keeps his own. Put yourselves in front of us, said she to them. And so all the ladies-in-waiting put themselves in front, and he began to kiss the princess. What can that commotion be by the pigsties? Asked the emperor, who was standing on the balcony. He rubbed his eyes, and he put on his spectacles. Why, those are the ladies-in-waiting playing their games. I must go down to them. And so he took off his shoes, which were shoes, though he had trodden them from down his slippers. What a hurry he was in, to be sure. As soon as he came into the yard, he walked very softly, and the ladies-in-waiting were so busy counting the kisses and seeing fair play that they never noticed the emperor. He stood on tiptoe. What is that? He said when he saw the kissing,
And then he threw one of his slippers at their heads, just as the swineherd was taking his 86th kiss. "Be off with you," said the emperor, for he was very angry, understandably. And the princess and the swineherd were driven out of the empire. Oops.
Alas, what an unhappy creature I am,
Sobbed the princess.
If only I had taken the beautiful prince. Alas, how unfortunate I am.
And a swineherd went behind a tree, washed off the black and brown from his face, threw away his old clothes, and stepped forward in his splendid dress, looking so beautiful that the princess was obliged to curtsy. "Now I come to this. I despise you," he said. "You would have nothing to do with a noble prince. You did not understand the rose or the nightingale. But you would kiss a swineherd for the sake of a toy. This is what you get for it." And he went to his kingdom and shut the door on her face. And she had to stay outside, singing,
"Where's my Augustus, dear? Alas, he's not here, here.
Okay, princesses, honestly. Well, I guess she's... Is the daughter of an emperor really a princess? I don't know if there's a different term for that or not. But honestly, the guy has a point. You'll kiss a swineherd for a toy, but you won't marry me for sending you, like, my most precious things. Anyway, our next wonderful, wonderful story. I'm gonna get a drink real quick. If I can open the bottle. I'm not drinking out of the bottle, I'm drinking out of my coffee mug. So, because I don't like drinking out of my coffee mug. Not that you can see it, but still. Anyway, the next story, the Satin Surgeon from the Olive Fairy Book. Once upon a time, there was a very rich and powerful king who, in spite of having been married several times, had only 2 daughters. Performance issues. The elder was extremely plain. She squinted, had a hunched back, but at the same time she was very clever and amusing, as though at heart both spiteful and untruthful. She was her father's favorite. What? The younger princess, on the other hand, was both lovely and sweet-tempered, and those who knew her well could hardly say whether her charming face or pleasant manners were more attractive. Boots. The neighboring country was governed by a young emperor, who, though not much over 20 years of age, had shown great courage in battle, and, had he wished it, might likely have conquered the whole world. Luckily, he preferred peace to war, and occupied his time with trying to rule his own kingdom well and wisely. Won't be an empire. Oh well. His people were very anxious that he should marry, and as the 2 princesses were the only ladies to be heard of suitable age and rank, the emperor sent envoys to their father's court to ask for the hand of one of them in marriage. But as he was resolved to marry a woman whom he could love and be happy with, he was determined to see the lady himself before making up his mind. For this purpose he set out in disguise not long after the departure of his ambassadors, and arrived at the palace very soon after they did. But as he had foolishly kept his plan secret, he found, when he reached the court, that they had already made proposals for the elder princess. Now, the emperor might have just have gone openly, for his presence soon became known, and when the king heard that, he had prepared to receive him royally. Though, of course, he had to pretend that he had no idea who he was. So it was settled that the ambassadors should present their master under the name of one of the princes, and in this manner he was received by the king. At night there was a grand ball at which the young emperor was able to see the two princesses and to make their acquaintance. The ugly face and figure and spiteful remarks of the elder displeased him greatly. So greatly that he felt he could not marry her even if she owned 10 kingdoms. Whilst the sweet face and gentle manners of the younger sister charmed him so much that he would gladly have shared his throne with her, had she only been a simple shepherdess. He found it very difficult to conceal his thoughts and to pay the older princess the amount of attention due to her, though he did his best to be polite. While all he saw or heard during the next few days only increased his love for her younger sister. And at last he confessed that his dearest wish was to make her his wife, if she and her father would grant his desire. He had commanded his ambassadors to put all their farewell audience for a little time, hoping that the king would perceive the state of his feelings. But when it could not be deferred any longer, he bade them propose in his name for the younger princess. On hearing this news, so different from what he had been led to expect, the king, who, as we have said before, was devoted to his elder daughter and entirely under her influence, could hardly contain his displeasure. Directly the audience was over, he sent for the princess and told her the insolent proposal the emperor had made for her sister. The princess was even more furious than her father, and after consulting together they decided to send the younger daughter to some distant place out of reach of the young emperor. But where they should be, they did not quite know. However, at length, after they had both racked their brains to find a suitable prison, they fixed on a lonely castle called the Desert Tower, where they thought she would be safe. Meantime, it was thought best to let the court gaieties go on as usual, and orders were given for all sorts of splendid entertainments, and on the day that was fixed for carrying off the princess, the whole court was invited to a great hunt in the forest. The emperor and the young princess were counting the hours till this morning, which promised to be so delightful, should dawn. The king and his guest arrived together at the meeting place, but what was the surprise and distress of the young man at not seeing the object of his love among the ladies present. He waited anxiously, looking up and down, not hearing anything that the king said to him, and when the hunt began, she was still absent. He declined to follow, and spent the whole day seeking her, but in vain. On his return,
one of his attendants told him that some hours before he had met the princess's carriage, escorted by a troop of soldiers who were riding on each side, so that no one could get speech of her. He had followed them at a distance and saw them stop at the desert tower, and on its return he noticed that the carriage was empty. The emperor was deeply grieved by the news. He left the court at once and ordered his ambassadors to declare war the very next day, unless the king promised to set free the princess. That's me. Ouch. And more than this, no sooner had he reached his own country than he raised a large army, with which he seized the frontier towns, before his enemy had time to collect any troops. But ere he quitted the court, he took care to write a letter to his beloved princess, imploring her to have patience and trust him. And this he gave into the hands of his favorite equerry, who would, he knew, lay down his life in service. With many precautions, the equerry managed to examine the surroundings of the tower, and at last discovered not only where the princess lodged, but that a little window in her room looked out on a desolate plot of brambles. Now the unhappy princess was much annoyed that she was even allowed to take the air in this little window, which was the only one in her room. Her keeper was her elder sister's former nurse, a woman whose eyes never slept. Nor for an instant could she be induced to stir from the side of the princess, and she watched her slightest movements. One day, however, the spy was for once busy in her room, waiting for an account of the princess to her elder sister. The poor prisoner seized the opportunity to lean out of the window. She looked about, and she noticed a man hidden among the bushes, who stepped forward as soon as he caught sight of her, and showed her a letter, which he took from his jerkin. At once she recognized him as the emperor's attendant, and let down a long string to which she tied the letter. You can fancy how quickly she drew it up again, and luckily she had just in time to read it before her jailer had finished the report and entered the room. The princess's delight was great, and the next day she managed to write an answer to the sheets of her notebook, and throw it down to the equerry, who hastened to carry it back to his master. The emperor was so happy at having news of his dear princess that he resolved, at all risks, to visit the desert tower himself, if only to see her for a moment. He ordered his equerry to ask leave to visit her, and the princess replied that she should indeed rejoice to see him, but that she feared that her jailer's watchfulness would make his journey useless, unless he came during the short time when the old woman was writing alone in her own room. Naturally, the bare idea of difficulties only made the emperor more eager than ever. He was ready to run any risks, but, by the advice of the equerry, he decided to try cunning rather than force. In his next letter he enclosed a sleeping powder, which the princess managed to mix with her jailer's supper, so that when the emperor reached the tower in the evening, the princess appeared fearlessly at her window on hearing his signal. They had a long and delightful conversation, and parted in the fond hope that their meeting had not been observed. But they were sadly mistaken. The watchful eyes of the old nurse were proof against any sleeping draught. She had seen and heard all, and lost no time in writing to report everything to her mistress.
The news made the spiteful little hunchback furious, and she resolved to be cruelly revenged for the contempt with which the Emperor had treated her. She ordered her nurse to pretend not to notice what might be passing, and meantime she had made a trap so that the Emperor pushed his way through the brambles at the foot of the tower. It would not only catch him, as if he were a mouse, it would let loose a number of poisoned arrows, which would pierce him all over. When it was ready, the trap was hidden among the brambles without being observed by the princess. The same evening, the Emperor hurried to the tower with all the impatience of love. As he came near, he heard the princess break into a long, joyous peal of laughter. He advanced quickly to give the usual signal, when suddenly his foot trod on something. He knew not what. A sharp, stinging pain ran through him, and he turned white and faint. But luckily the trap had only opened a little way, and only a few of the arrows flew out. For a moment he staggered, then fell to the ground, covered in blood. He had been alone, he thought. But his faithful squire had been close at hand, and carried his master off to the wood where the rest of the escort were waiting for him. His wounds were bound up, and some poles were cut to make a long, rough litter, and, almost unconscious, the Emperor was borne away out of his enemy's territory to his own palace. All this time the princess was feeling very anxious. She had been whiling away the hours before this meeting by playing with a little pet monkey which had been making such funny faces at her. In spite of her trouble, she had burst into a hearty laugh, overheard by the Emperor. But by and by she grew restless, waiting for the signal, which never came. And, had she dared, would certainly have rebelled against her jailer, whom she believed to be fast asleep, and had ordered her to go to bed at once. A fortnight passed, which was spent with great anxiety by the poor girl. She grew thin and weak with uncertainty. At the end of this period, when the nurse went to her room one morning, as usual, to write her daily report, she carelessly left the keys in the door. This was perceived by the princess, who turned it on her so quickly and quietly that she never found out she was locked until she had finished writing, got up to seek her charge. Finding herself free, the princess flew to the window, and to her horror she saw arrows lying among the blood-stained brambles. Distracted with terror, she slipped down the stairs and out the tower and ran some time along the path. When the great good luck she met the husband of her own nurse, who had just learned of her imprisonment and was on his way to try to find whether he could serve her. The princess begged him to get her some men's clothes while she waited him in a little wood close by. The good man was overjoyed to be of use, and started at once for the nearest town, where he soon discovered a shop where the court lackeys were accustomed to sell their master's cast-off clothes. Lackeys. The princess dressed herself at once in the disguise he had bought, which was of rich material, and covered with precious stones, and, putting her own garments into a bag, which her servant hung over her shoulder, they both set off on their journey. This lasted longer than either of them suspected. They walked by day as far as the princess could manage, and by night they slept in the open air. One evening they camped in a lovely valley, watered by a rippling stream, and towards morning the princess was awakened by a charming voice singing one of the songs of her own childhood.
Anxious to find out where the song came from, she walked into a thicket of myrtles, where she saw a little boy with a quiver on his back and an ivory bow in his hand, singing softly to himself as he smoothed the feathers of his shafts. Arrows. "Are you surprised seeing my eyes open?" he asked with a smile. I'm not always blind, and sometimes it is well to know what sort of heart needs piercing. It was I who sent out my darts that day that you and the Emperor met. So as I have caused the wound, I am duty-bound to find the cure." Then he gave her a little bottle full of a wonderful salve, with which to dress the Emperor's wounds when she found him. The princess thanked the boy, and with tears in her eyes, and hastened to wake her guide so that they might start, and set out at once on their way. As the boy had foretold, in 2 days the tower and the walls of the city came within sight, and her heart beat wildly at the thought that she would soon be face to face with her emperor. But on inquiring after his health, she learned, to her horror, that it was sinking fast. For a moment her grief was so great that she nearly betrayed herself. Then, calling all her courage to her aid, she announced that she was a doctor, and that if they could leave him in her charge for a few days, she would promise to cure him. Now, in order to make a good appearance at the court, the new doctor resolved to have an entire suit made of pale blue satin. She bought the richest and most splendid stuff to be had in the shops, and summoned a tailor to make it for her, engaging to pay him double if he would finish the work in 2 hours. Wow. Next she went to the market, where she bought a fine mule, bidding her servants see that its harness was adorned with trappings of blue satin also. Whilst all was being made ready, the princess asked a woman in whose house she lived whether she knew any of the Emperor's attendants, and found to her satisfaction that her cousin was His Majesty's chief valet. Convenient. The doctor then bade the woman inform everyone that she met. On hearing the Emperor's illness, a celebrated surgeon had hastened to attend him, and had undertaken to cure him entirely, declaring himself prepared to be burnt alive in case of failure. The good woman, who had nothing better to do than a bit of gossip, hurried to the town with her news. Her story did not lose in the telling. The court physicians were very scornful at the newcomer, but the Emperor's attendants remarked that, as in spite of their remedies, His Majesty was dying before their very eyes, there could be no harm in consulting a stranger. So the Lord Chamberlain begged the young doctor to come and prescribe the royal patient without delay. And the doctor sent a message at once that he would do himself the honor to present himself at the palace, and he lost no time in mounting his mule and setting out. As the people and soldiers saw him ride past, they shouted, "Here comes the Satin Surgeon! Look at the Satin Surgeon! Long live the Satin Surgeon!" And on arriving, he was announced by this name, and at once taken to the sick room of the dying man. The Emperor was lying with his eyes closed, and his face was as white as the pillow itself. But directly he heard the newcomer's voice, he looked up and smiled, and signed that he wished the doctor to remain near him. Making a low bow, the Satin Surgeon assured the Emperor that he felt certain of curing his malady, but insisted that everyone should leave the room except the Emperor's favorite equerry. Then he addressed the wounds with the magic salve which the boy had given him, and it relieved the Emperor's pain that he slept soundly all night. When the morning broke, the courtiers and doctors hurried to the Emperor's chamber, and were much surprised to find him free of pain. But they were promptly ordered out of the room by the Satin Surgeon, who renewed the dressing with such good results that next morning the Emperor was nearly well and able to leave his bed. As he grew stronger, his thoughts dwelt more and more on the cause of all his sufferings, and his spirits grew worse as his health grew stronger. The face and voice of his new doctor reminded him of the princess, who had, he imagined, betrayed him and caused him such dreadful torture, and unable to bear the thought, his eyes filled with tears. The doctor had noticed this sad countenance, and did all he could to enliven his patient with cheerful talk and amusing stories, till at last he won the Emperor's confidence and heard all the story of his love for the lady who had treated him cruelly, but whom, in spite of everything, he could not help loving. The Satin Surgeon listened with sympathy, and tried to persuade the Emperor that possibly the princess was not much to blame as it might appear. But eager though the sick man was to believe this, it took a long while to persuade him of it. At length a day came when the Emperor was nearly well, and for the last time the doctor dressed the wounds with the precious salve. Then both patient and surgeon, being wearied out with something they could not explain, fell asleep and slept for hours. Early next morning, the princess, having decided to resume her own clothes, which she had brought with her in a bag, dressed herself with great care, and put on all the jewels as to make herself look as lovely as possible. She had just finished when the Emperor awoke, feeling so strong and well that he thought he must be dreaming, nor could he believe himself to be awake, when he saw the princess drew aside his curtains. For some moments they gazed at each other, unable to speak, and they only uttered little gasps of joy and thankfulness. By and by the princess told him the whole story of her adventures since their last interview at the desert tower, and the Emperor, as weak as he was, threw himself at her feet with vows of love and gratitude, without ever giving a thought to the fact that the household and court physicians were waiting their summons in the anteroom. The Emperor, anxious to prove how much he owed the Satin Surgeon, opened his door himself, and great was everyone's surprise and joy at seeing him in such perfect health. Like good courtiers, they hastened in the praise and compliment to the Satin Surgeon. But what was their astonishment on finding that he had disappeared, leaving in his place the loveliest princess in the whole world. Whilst thanking the surgeon for his miraculous cure, he might at the same time do homage to your empress, observed the Emperor. He wished to have the marriage celebrated the same day, but the princess declared that she must wait to get her father's permission first. Messengers were therefore instantly dispatched to the neighboring capital, and soon returned with the king's consent, for he had lately discovered all this mischief caused by his eldest daughter. The spiteful princess was so furious at the failure of her plans that she had took to her bed and died in a fit of rage and jealousy.
no loss. No one grieved for her, and the king, being tired of the fatigues of the government, gave up his crown to his youngest daughter, and the two kingdoms henceforth became one. Ugh. Older siblings. Sometimes they mean good, sometimes they just want you dead. Luckily, my older sister's not that bad. Don't tell her I said that. Anyway. I do like these stories, really. Our next wonderful story The Enchanted Wreath from Orange Fairy Book. Once upon a time there lived near a forest a man and his wife and their two girls. One girl was the daughter of the man, the other the daughter of his wife. And the man's daughter was good and beautiful, but the woman's daughter was cross and ugly. However, her mother did not know that, but thought her the most bewitching maiden that ever was seen. One day the man called to his daughter and bade her come with him into the forest to cut wood. They worked hard all day, but in spite of the chopping, they were very cold, for it rained heavily, and they returned home. They were wet through and through. Then, to his vexation, the man found that he had left his axe behind, and he knew that if it lay all night in the mud, it would become rusty and useless. So he said to his wife, "I've dropped my axe in the forest. Bid your daughter to go and fetch it, for mine has worked all day and is both wet and weary." But the wife answered,
"If your daughter's wet already, it is no more reason than she should go and get the axe. Besides, she is a great strong girl, and a little rain will not hurt her, while my daughter would be sure to catch a bad cold."
By long experience, the man knew there was no good in saying any more. And with a sigh, he told the poor girl she must return to the forest for the axe. The walk took some time, for it was very dark, and her shoes often got stuck in the mud. But she was brave as well as beautiful, best kind, and never thought of turning back merely because the path was both difficult and unpleasant. At last, with her dress torn by brambles that she could not see, and her face scratched by the twigs of the trees, she reached the spot where she and her father had been cutting in the morning, and found the axe in the place he had left it. To her surprise, 3 little doves were sitting on the handle, and all of them looking very sad.
"You poor little things,"
said the girl, stroking them.
"why do you sit there and get wet? Go and fly home to your nest. It will be much warmer there than this. But first, eat this bread, which I have saved for my dinner, and perhaps you will feel happier. It is my father's axe you are sitting on, and I must take it back as fast as I can, for I shall get a terrible scolding from my stepmother."
Then she crumbled the bread on the ground, and was pleased to see the little doves flutter down quite cheerfully towards it.
"Goodbye,"
she said, picking up the axe, and went her way homewards. By the time they had finished all the crumbs, the doves felt much better, and they were able to fly back to their nest on top of the tree.
"That is a good girl,"
said one.
"I really was too weak to stretch out a wing before she came. I should like to do something to show how grateful I am." "Well, let us give her a wreath of flowers. It will never fade as long as she wears it,"
cried another.
"Ouch." And the tiniest singing birds in the world sitting on the flowers, rejoiced the third. Yes, that will do beautifully, said the first. And when the girl stepped into her cottage, a wreath of rosebuds was on her head, and a crowd of little birds were singing unseen. Sounds like a cartoon or a bird. The father, who was sitting by the fire, thought that, in spite of her muddy clothes, he had never seen his daughter looking so lovely. But the stepmother and the other girl grew wild with envy. Stepsons. How absurd to walk about in such a pouring night, dressed up like that, she remarked crossly, and roughly pulling off the wreath as she spoke, to place it on her own daughter. As she did, with the roses became withered and brown, and the birds flew out the window. See what trumpery thing it is, cried the stepmother. Now take your supper and go to bed, for it is near upon midnight. But though she pretended to despise the wreath, she longed none the less for her daughter to have one like it. Now, it happened that the next evening, the father, who had been alone in the forest, came back a second time, without his axe. The stepmother's heart was glad when she saw this, and she said quite mildly, Why, you have forgotten your axe again, you careless man. No, your daughter shall stay at home, and mine shall go and bring it back. And throwing a cloak over her girl's shoulder, she bade her hasten to the forest. With a very ill grace the damsel set forth, grumbling to herself as she went, for though she wished for a wreath, she did not want all the trouble of getting it. By the time she reached the spot where her stepfather had been cutting the wood, the girl was in a very bad temper indeed. And when she caught sight of the axe, there were the three little doves with drooping heads and soiled, bedraggled feathers sitting on the handle. You dirty creatures, she cried. Get away at once, or I will throw stones at you. And the doves spread their wings in a fright and flew up to the very top of a tree, their bodies shaking with anger. What shall we do to revenge ourselves on her? Asked the smallest of the doves. We were never treated like that before. Never, said the biggest dove. We must find some way of paying her back on her own coin. I know, answered the middle dove. She shall never be able to say anything but dirty creatures for the end of her life. Wow. Oh, how clever of you! That will do beautifully, exclaimed the other two. And they flapped their wings and clucked so loud with delight, and made such a noise that they woke up all of the birds in the trees close by. What in the world is the matter? Asked the birds sleepily. That is our secret, said the doves. Meanwhile, the girl had reached home crosser than ever. But as soon as her mother heard her lift the latch of the doors, that she ran out to hear her adventures. Well, did you get the wreath? She cried. Dirty creatures, answered the daughter. Don't speak to me like that. What do you mean? Asked the mother again. Dirty creatures, repeated the girl, and nothing else could she say. Then the woman saw that something evil had befallen her, and turned in her rage to her stepdaughter, as one does. You were at the bottom of this, I know it, she cried, and as the father was out of the way, she took a stick and beat the girl till she screamed with pain and went to bed sobbing. Wow. If the poor girl's life had been miserable before, it was 10 times worse now. For the moment her father's back was turned, the others treated and tormented her from morning till night, and their fury was increased by the sight of her wreath, which the doves had placed again on her head. Things went on this way for some weeks. Then one day, as the king's son was riding through the forest, He heard some strange birds singing more sweetly than the birds had ever sung before. He tied his horse to a tree and followed where the sound led him, and, to his surprise, he saw before him a beautiful girl chopping wood, with a wreath of pink rosebuds, out of which singing came. Standing in the shelter of a tree, he watched her for a long while, and then, hat in hand, he went up and spoke to her. "Fair maiden, who are you, and who gave you that wreath of singing roses?" he asked, for the birds were so tiny that you looked closely, you would never see them. "I live in a hut on the edge of the forest," she answered, blushing, for she had never spoken to a prince before. "As to the wreath, I know not how it came there, unless it may be a gift of some doves whom I fed when they were starving." The prince was delighted with this answer, which showed the goodness of the girl's heart, and besides he had fallen in love with her beauty, as princes do, and would not be content till she promised to return with him to the palace and become his bride. Princes, am I right? The old king was naturally disappointed at his son's choice of wife, and he wished him to marry a neighboring princess. But as from his birth the prince had always done exactly as he liked, nothing was said, and the splendid wedding feast was got ready. The day after her marriage, the bride sent a messenger, bearing handsome presents to her father, and telling him of the good fortune which had befallen her. As may be imagined, the stepmother and her daughter were so filled with envy that they grew quite ill, and had to take to their beds, and nobody would have been sorry if they had never got up again. But that did not happen. At length, however, they began to feel better, for the mother invented a plan by which she could be revenged on the girl who had never done her any harm. Stepmothers. Her plan was this. In the town where she had lived before she was married, there was an old witch. Who had more skill in magic than any other witch she knew. Did you know a lot of witches? I can say. To this witch she would go and beg her to make a mask with the face of her stepdaughter, and when she had the mask, the rest would be easy. She told her daughter what she meant to do, and although the daughter could only say, "Dirty creatures," in answer she nodded and smiled and looked very pleased. Everything fell out exactly as the woman had hoped, and by the aid of her magic mirror the witch beheld the new princess walking in her gardens in a dress of green silk, and in a few minutes had produced a mask so like her that very few people could have told the difference. However, she counseled the woman that when her daughter first wore it, for that, of course, was what she had intended to do, she had better pretend that she had a toothache, and cover her face with a lace veil. The woman thanked her and paid her well, and returned to her hut, carrying the mask under her cloak. In a few days she heard a great hunt was planned, and the prince would leave the palace very early in the morning, so that his wife would be alone all day. This was a chance not to be missed, and taking her daughter with her, she went up to the palace, where she had never been before. The princess was too happy in her new home to remember all that she had suffered from the old one, and she welcomed them both great gladly, and gave them quantities of beautiful things to take back with them. At last she took them down to the shore to see the pleasure boat which her husband had made for her, and here the woman, seizing the opportunity,
stole softly behind the girl and pushed her off a rock on which she was standing into the deep water, where she instantly sank to the bottom. Then she fastened the mask on her daughter, flung her over her shoulders a velvet cloak, which the princess had let fall, and finally arranged the lace veil over her face.
"Rest your cheek on your hand as if you were in pain when the prince returns," said the mother, "and be careful not to speak, whatever you do. I will go back to the witch and see if she cannot take off the spell laid on you by those horrible birds. Why did I not think of it before?"
No sooner had the prince entered the palace than he hastened to the princess's apartment, where he found her lying on the sofa, apparently in great pain. "My dearest wife, what is the matter with you?" he cried, kneeling down beside her, trying to take her hand. But she snatched it away, and pointed to her cheek, murmured something which he could not catch. Disgusting creature. "What is it? Tell me. Is the pain bad? When did it begin? Shall I send your ladies a bath in the palace?" asked the prince, pouring out these and other dozens of questions which the girl only shook her head. "But I can't leave you like this," he continued, starting up. "I must summon all the court physicians to apply soothing balms at the Store place." As he spoke, he sprang to his feet to go and search for him. This so frightened his pretended wife, who knew that if the physicians came near her, the trick would be at once discovered, and she forgot her mother's counsel not to speak, and forgot even the spell that had been laid upon her, and catching hold of the prince's tunic, she cried in tones of entreaty,
"Dirty creatures!"
The young man stopped, not able to believe his ears. He supposed that the pain made the princess cross, as it sometimes does. However, he guessed somehow that she wished to be left alone. So he only said, "Well, I dare say a little sleep will do you good. If you can manage to get it, and that you will wake up better tomorrow." Now, that hut happened to be very hot and airless, and the prince, after vainly trying to rest, got up and went to the window. Suddenly he beheld in the moonlight a form with a wreath of roses on her head rise out of the sea below him and step onto the sands, holding out her arms as she did so towards the palace. "That maiden is strangely like my wife," he thought. "I must see her closely." He hastened down to the water, but when he got there, the princess, for she was indeed, had disappeared completely, and he began to wonder if his eyes had deceived him. The next morning he went to the false bride's room, but the ladies told her that she would neither speak nor get up, though she ate everything they set before her. The prince was sorely perplexed as to what could be the matter with her, so naturally he could not guess that she was expecting her mother to return every moment, and to remove the spell the doves had laid upon her, and meanwhile was afraid to speak lest she should betray herself. At length he made up his mind to summon all his court physicians. He did not tell her that I was going to do so, lest it should make her worse. But he went himself and begged the 4 learned leeches attached to the king's person to follow him to the princess's apartment. And the leeches. Unfortunately, as they entered, the princess was so enraged at the sight of them that she forgot about the doves and shrieked out,
"Dirty creatures! Dirty creatures!"
which so offended the physicians that they left the room at once, and nothing that the prince could say would prevail them to return. Then he tried to persuade his wife to send them a message that she was sorry for her rudeness, but not a word would she say. Late that evening, when he had performed all these tiresome duties, which fall on the lot of every prince, The young man was leaning out his window, refreshing himself with the cool breezes that blew off the sea. His thoughts went back to that scene of that morning, and he wondered if, after all, he had made a great mistake in marrying such a low-born wife. However beautiful she might be, how could he have imagined that the quiet, gentle girl who had been such a charming companion to him during the first days of their marriage could have become in a day the rude, sulky woman who could not control her temper even to benefit herself? One thing was clear. If she did not change her conduct very shortly, he would have to send her away from the court. Good. He was thinking those thoughts when his eyes fell on the sea beneath him, and there, as before, was the figure that so closely resembled his wife, standing with her feet in the water, holding her arms out to him. "Wait for me! Wait for me! Wait for me!" he cried, not even knowing he was speaking. But when he reached the shore, there was nothing to be seen but the shadows cast by the moonlight. A state ceremonial was a city some distance off caused the prince to ride away at daybreak, and he left without seeing his wife again. "Perhaps she may come to her senses by tomorrow," said he to himself. "And anyhow, if I'm going to send her back to her father, it might be better if we did not meet in the meantime." Then he put the matter out of his mind, and kept his thoughts on the duty that lay before him. It was nearly midnight before he returned to the palace, but instead of entering, he went down to the shore and hid behind a rock. He had scarcely done so when the girl came out of the sea and stretched out her arms towards his window. In an instant the prince had seized her hand, and though she made a frightened struggle to reach the water, for she, in her turn, had had a spell laid on her, he held her fast. "You are my own wife, and I shall never let you go," said he. But the words were hardly out of his mouth when he found that it was a hare that he was holding by the paw. When the hare changed into a fish, and the fish into a bird, and the bird into a slimy, wriggling snake. This time the prince's hand nearly opened itself, but with a strong effort to keep his fingers shut, and drawing his sword, cut off its head. When the spell was broken, and the girl stood before him, he had seen her first. Wreath upon her head, and the birds singing for joy. The very next morning the stepmother arrived at the palace with an ointment that the old witch gave her to place on her daughter's tongue, which should break the dove's spell. It was the rightful bride really drowned in the sea. If not, then it would be useless. The mother assured her that she had seen the stepdaughter sink, and that there was no fear that she would ever come up again. But to make all quite safe, the old woman might bewitch the girl, and so she did. After that, the wicked stepmother traveled all through the night to get to the palace as soon as possible, and made her way straight into her daughter's room. "I have got it! I have got it!" she cried triumphantly, and laid the ointment on her daughter's tongue. "Now, what do you say?" she said proudly. "Dirty creatures! Dirty creatures!" answered the daughter, and the mother wrung her hands and wept, as she knew that all her plans had failed. At this moment, the prince entered with his real wife. "You both deserve death," he said, "and if it were left to me, you should have it. But the princess has so begged me to spare your lives, so you will be put into a ship and carried off to a desert island, where you will stay till you die." Then the ship was made ready, and the wicked woman and her daughter were placed in it, and it sailed away, and no more was heard of them.
But the prince and his wife lived together long and happily, and ruled their people well. Because, yeah, stepmothers. As they say in uh, Into the Woods, you'll never love anyone as much as your own child, despite how much of a hideous troll they apparently are. Anyway, our next and possibly final story for the night. Maybe final because I think they're singing in it. I don't want to sing many more songs. Let's see. How many pages? It's only 12 pages. 13 pages, technically. Yeah, I'll go and make this the last one, just because I'm probably going to wander around and ramble aimlessly while I'm telling the story, or before I tell the story. Or like I'm rambling right now, one or the other. But, it's a big but, rather fancy. Our final story, at least I'm going to say it's the final story, is Princess Rosette from the Red Fairy Book. Once upon a time, there lived a king and a queen who had 2 beautiful sons and 1 little daughter, who was so pretty that no one who saw her could help loving her. When it was time for the christening of the princess, the queen, as she always did, sent for all the fairies to be present at the ceremony, afterwards inviting them to a splendid banquet. But I have to follow the rules. When it is over, and they are preparing to go away, the queen said to them, "Do not forget your usual good custom. Tell me what is going to happen to Rosette." For that was the name they were going to give the princess. Was her christening, after all. But the fairies said that they had left their book of magic at home, and they would come another day to tell her. "Ah," said the queen, "I know very well what that means. You have nothing good to say, but at least I beg that you will not hide anything from me." So, after a great deal of persuasion, they said, "Madam, we fear that Rosette may be the cause of great misfortunes to her brothers. They may even meet with their death through her. That is all we have been able to foresee about your little daughter. We are very sorry we have nothing better to tell you." Then they went away, leaving the queen very sad. So sad that the king noticed it, and he asked her what was the matter. The queen said that she had been sitting too near the fire and had burnt all the flax that was upon her distaff. "Oh, is that all?" said the king, and he went up to the garret and brought down some more flax that she could spin into 100 years. But the queen still looked sad, and the king asked her again what was the matter. She answered that she had been walking by the river and dropped one of her green satin slippers into the water. "Oh, if that's all," said the king, and he sent all the shoemakers in his kingdom, and they very soon made the queen 10,000 green satin slippers. But she still looked very sad. So the king asked her again what was the matter, and this time she answered that in eating her porridge too hastily, she had swallowed her wedding ring. But it so happened that the king knew better, for he had the ring himself, and said, if you are not telling me the truth, for I have your ring here in my purse." Then the queen was very much ashamed, and she saw that the king was vexed with her. So she told him that the fairies had predicted about Rosette, and begged him to think how the misfortunes might be prevented. Then it was the king's turn to look sad, and he said, "I see no way of saving our sons except by having Rosette's head cut off while she is still little." The hell? But the queen cried that she would far rather have her own head cut off, and that he had better think of something else, for she would never consent to such a thing. So they thought and thought, but they could not tell what to do, until at last the queen heard in the great forest near the castle there was an old hermit who lived in a hollow tree, and that people came from far and near to consult him. So she said, "I had better go and ask for his advice. Perhaps he will know what to do to prevent our misfortunes with the fairies have foretold." So she set out very early the next morning, mounted upon a pretty little white mule, which was shod with solid gold, and two of her ladies rode behind her on beautiful horses. When they reached the forest, they dismounted, for the trees grew so thickly that the horses could not pass, and made their way on foot to the hollow tree where the hermit lived. At first, when he saw them coming, he was vexed, for he was not fond of ladies. But when he recognized the queen, he said, "You are welcome, queen. What do you come to ask for me?" Then the queen told him all the fairies had foreseen for Rosette, and asked what she should do. And the hermit answered that she must shut the princess up in a tower, and never let her come out again. The queen thanked and rewarded him, and hastened back to the castle to tell the king. When he heard the news, he had a great tower built as quickly as possible. And when the princess was shut up, and the king and queen and her two brothers went to see her every day that she might not get dulled. The eldest brother was called the Great Prince, the second the Little Prince. And they loved their sister dearly, for she was the sweetest and prettiest princess who was ever seen. And the least little smile from her was worth more than 100 pieces of gold. When Rosette was 15 years old, the Great Prince went to the king and asked if it would not be time for her to be married. And the Little Prince put up the same question. Their Majesties were amused at them for thinking of it, but did not make any reply. And soon both the king and queen were taken ill and died on the same day. Everybody was sorry, Rosette especially, and all the bells in the kingdom were tolled. Then all the dukes and councillors put on the Great Prince upon a golden throne, and crowned him with a diamond crown, and they all cried, "Long live the king!" And after that, there was nothing but feasting and rejoicing. The new king and his brother said to one another, "Now that we are masters, let us take our sister out of that dull tower which she is so tired of." They only had to go across the garden to reach the tower, which was very high and stood up in a corner. Rosette was busy with her embroidery, and when she saw her brothers, she got up and, taking the king's hand, cried, "Good morning, dear brother. Now that you are king, please take me out of this dull tower, for I am so tired of it." Then she began to cry, but the king kissed her and told her to dry her tears, and that she was just what they had come to do, to take her out of the tower and to bring her into their beautiful castle. And the prince showed her the pocketful of sugar plums he had brought for her, and said, "Make haste, and let us get away from this ugly tower, for very soon the king will arrange a grand marriage for you."
When Rosette saw the beautiful garden, full of fruits and flowers, with green grass and sparkling fountains, she was so astonished that not a word could she say, for she had never in her life seen anything like it before. She looked about her, and ran hither and thither, gathering fruits and flowers, and her little dog Frisk, who was bright green all over, but had one ear, danced before her, crying, "Bow, wow, wow!" and turning head over heels in the most enchanting way. He was a white dog rolling in fresh grass. I'll just say that. Everyone was amused at Frisk's antics, but it was sudden he ran away into the little wood, and the princess was following after him, when to her great delight she saw a peacock, who was spreading its tail in the sunshine. Rosette thought she had never seen anything so pretty. She could not take her eyes off him, and there she stood entranced until the king and prince came up and asked her what was so amusing. She showed them the peacock and asked what it was, and they answered that it was the bird which people sometimes ate.
"What?" the princess. "Do they dare kill that beautiful creature and eat it? I declare I will never marry anyone but the king of the peacocks, and when I am queen I will take very good care that nobody eats any of my subjects."
Princesses. At this the king was very much astonished. "But, little sister," he said, "where shall we find the king of the peacocks?"
"Oh, wherever you like, sire," she answered, "but I will never marry anyone else."
Princesses. After this they took Rosette to the beautiful castle, and the peacock was brought with her, and told to walk about on the terrace outside her window, so that she might always see him. And the ladies of the court came to see the princess, and they thought her beautiful presents, ribbons and dresses and sweetmeats, pearls and diamonds, dolls and embroidered slippers. And she was so brought up and said, "Thank you," so prettily, and was so gracious that everyone went away delighted with her. Meanwhile, the king and the prince were considering how they should find the king of the peacocks, if there was such a person in the world. And first of all, they had a portrait made of the princess, which was so like her that you really would have to be surprised if you had not spoken to. Then they said to her, "Since you will not marry anyone but the king of peacocks, we are going out together into the wide world to search for him. If we find him for you, we shall be very glad. In the meantime, mind you take good care of our kingdom." Rosette thanked them for all the trouble they were taking on her account, and promised to take great care of the kingdom, and only to amuse herself by looking at the peacock and making Frisk dance while they were away. So they set out and asked everyone they met, "Do you know the king of peacocks?" But the answer was always, "No, no." Then they went on and on, so far that no one has ever been farther, and at last they came to the kingdom of the cockchafers. They had never before seen such a number of cockchafers, and the buzzing was so loud that the king was afraid he would be deafened by it. He asked the most distinguished-looking cockchafer if they if they met, if they knew who and where they could find the king of the peacocks.
"Sat," said the cockchafer, "this kingdom is 30,000 leagues from this. You have come the longest way."
"And how do you know that?" said the king.
"Oh,"
said the cockchafer,
"we all know you very well, since we spend 2 or 3 months in your garden every year."
Thereupon the king and the prince made great friends with him, And they walked arm in arm and dined together, and afterwards the cockchafer showed them all the curiosities of his strange country, where the finest green leaf costs a gold piece and more. Then they set out again to finish their journey, and this time they knew the way, and they were not long upon the road. It was easy to guess that they'd come to the right place, for they saw peacocks in every tree. Their cries could be heard a long way off. Peacocks are loud, if you ever heard one. When they reached the city, they found it full of men and women who were dressed entirely with peacock's feathers, which were evidently thought prettier than anything else. They soon met the king, who was driving about in a beautiful little golden carriage which glittered with diamonds, and was drawn at full speed by 12 peacocks. The king and the prince were delighted to see that the king of peacocks was as handsome as possible. He had curly golden hair and was very pale, and he wore a crown of peacock feathers. When he saw Rosette's brothers, he knew at once that they were strangers, and stopping his carriage, he sent for them to speak to him. And they had greeted him, they said, "Sire, we have come from very far away to show you a beautiful portrait." So saying, they drew from their traveling bag the picture of Rosette. The king looked at it in silence for a long time, but at last he said, "I could not have believed that there was such a beautiful princess in the world." "Indeed, she is really 100 times pretty as that," said the brothers. "I think you must be making fun of me," replied the king of peacocks. "Sire," said the prince, "my brother is a king like yourself. He is called the king, and I am called the prince, and that is the portrait of our sister, the Princess Rosette. We have come to ask you if you would like to marry her. She is as good as she is beautiful, and we will give her a bushel of gold pieces for her dowry." "Oh, with all my heart," replied the king, "and I will make her very happy. She shall have whatever she likes, and I shall love her dearly. Only, I'll warn you that if she is not as pretty as you have told me, I will cut off both of your heads." "Oh, certainly, we agree to that," said one of the brothers in one breath. "Very well. Off with you to prison, and stay there until the princess arrives," said the king of the peacocks. Well, and the princes were so sure that Rosette was far prettier than her portrait that they went without a murmur. They were very kindly treated, and that they might not feel dull, the king came to see them often. As for Rosette's portrait that had taken up to the palace, the king did nothing but gaze at it all night and all day. As the king and the prince had to stay in the prison, they sent a letter to the princess, telling her to pack up all her treasures as quickly as possible and come to them, as the king of the peacocks was waiting to marry her. But they did not say that they were in prison for fear of making her uneasy. When Rosette received the letter, she was so delighted that she ran about telling everyone that the king of peacocks was found, and that she was going to marry him. Guns were fired, and fireworks lit off. Everyone had many cakes and sweetmeats as they wanted, and for 3 days everybody who came to see the princess was presented with a slice of bread and jam, a nightingale's egg, and some hippocras. Tasty. Thus, having entertained her friends, she distributed her dolls among them, and left her brother's kingdom to the care of the wisest old man in the city, telling them to take care of everything and not to spend all the money, but to save it all up until the king should return, and above all, not to forget to feed her peacock. Then she set out, only taking with her her nurse, and the nurse's daughter, and the little green dog Frisk.
They took a boat and put out to sea, and carrying with them a bushel of gold pieces and enough dresses to last the princess 10 years if she wore every 2 a day. They did nothing but laugh and sing. The nurse asked the boatman, Can you take us to the kingdom of the peacocks? But he answered, Oh no, oh no. Then she said, You must take us, you must take us. And he answered, Very soon, very soon. Then the nurse said, Will you take us, will you take us? And the boatman answered, Yes, yes. Then she whispered in his ear, Do you want to make your fortune? And he said, Certainly I do. I can tell you how to get a bag of gold, she said. I ask for nothing better, said the boatman. Well, said the nurse, tonight when the princess is asleep, you must help me throw her into the sea. And when she's drowned, I will put her beautiful clothes upon my daughter, and we will take her to the king of the peacocks, who will be only too glad to marry her. And as a reward, you shall have your boat full of diamonds. The boatman was very much surprised at this proposal, and said, But what a pity to drown such a pretty princess. However, at last the nursemaid persuaded him to help her, and when the night came, and the princess was fast asleep, as usual, with Frisk curled up on his own cushion at the foot of her bed, the wicked nurse fetched the boatman and her daughter, and between them they picked up the princess, feather bed, mattress, pillows, blankets and all, and threw her into the sea, without even waking her. Now, luckily the princess's bed was entirely stuffed with phoenix feathers, which are rare, and have the property of always floating upon water. Go figure. So Rosette went on swimming about as if she had been on a boat. After a little while she began feeling very cold, and turning around so often that she woke Frisk, who started up, and having a very good nose, smelt the soles and herrings so close to him that he began to bark. He barked so long and loud that he woke all the other fish, who came swimming up around the princess's bed and poking at it with their great heads. As for her, she said to herself, Oh, how our boat does rock upon the water. I'm really glad that I'm not often as uncomfortable as I have been tonight. The wicked nurse and the boatman, who were by this time quite a long way off, heard Frisk barking, said to each other, That horrid little animal and his mistress are drinking our health in sea-water now. Let us make haste to land, for we must be quite near the city of the King of the Peacocks. The king had sent 100 carriages down to meet them, drawn by every strange kind of animal. There were lions, bears, wolves, stags, horses, buffaloes, eagles, and peacocks. The carriage intended for the Princess Rosette had 6 blue monkeys, who could turn somersaults and dance on a tightrope, and do many other charming tricks. Their harness was all crimson rope, and with gold buckles. And behind the carriage walked 60 beautiful ladies, chosen by the king to wait upon Rosette and amuse her. The nurse had taken all the pains imaginable to deck out her daughter. She put on Rosette's prettiest frock, covered her with diamonds from head to foot. But she was so ugly that nothing could make her look nice, and what was worse, she was always sulky and ill-tempered and did nothing but grumble all the time. Teenager.
When she stepped from the boat, the escort of men sent by the king and peacocks caught sight of her, and they were so surprised that they could not say a single word. "Now then, look alive," cried the false princess. "If you don't bring me something to eat, I shall have all your heads cut off." Then they whispered one to another, "There's a pretty state of things. She is as wicked as she is ugly. What a bride for our poor king. She certainly was not worth bringing from the other world to this end." But she went on ordering them all about, and for no fault at all would give slaps and pinches to everyone she could reach. As the procession went so long, it advanced quite slowly, and the nurse's daughter sat up in her carriage trying to look like a queen. But the peacocks, who were sitting upon every tree waiting to salute her, and who made up all their minds to cry, "Long live our beautiful queen!" when they caught sight of the false bride, could not help crying instead, "Oh, how ugly she is!" which offended her so much that she said to the guards, "Make haste and kill all these insolent peacocks who have dared to insult me." But the peacocks only flew away, laughing at her. The rogue of a boatman, who noticed all this, said softly to the nurse, "This is a bad business for us. Gossip, your daughter ought to have been prettier." But she answered, "Be quiet, stupid, or you'll spoil everything." Now they told the king that the princess was approaching. "Well," he said, "did her brothers tell me truly? Is she prettier than her portrait?" Sire," they answered, "if she was pretty, that would be all very well and good." "That's true," said the king. "I, for one, shall be quite satisfied if she is. Let us go and meet her." For they knew by the uproar that she had arrived, but they could not tell all what the shouting was about. The king thought he could hear the words, "How ugly she is! How ugly she is!" and he fancied that he must refer to some dwarf the princess was bringing with her. It never occurred to him that they could apply to the bride herself. The Princess Rosette's portrait was carried by the head of the procession, and after it walked the king, surrounded by his courtiers. He was all impatient to see the lovely princess, but when he caught sight of the nurse's daughter, he was furiously angry, and would not advance another step, for she was really ugly enough to have frightened anybody. "Wow! What?" he cried. "Have those two rascals who are my prisoners dared play such a trick at this? Do as they propose. I shall marry this hideous creature. Let her be shut up in my great tower, with her nurse and those who brought her here. As for them, I will have their heads cut off." Meanwhile, the king and the prince, who knew that their sister must have arrived, made themselves smart, and sat expectingly every minute to be summoned to greet her. So, when the jailer came with soldiers, and carried them down to the black dungeon which swarmed with toads and bats, and where they were put up to their necks in water, nobody could have been more surprised or dismayed as they were. "This is kind of a dismal wedding," they said. "What could have happened that we should be treated like this? They must mean to kill us." This idea annoyed them very much. 3 days passed before they heard any news, and then the king of the peacocks came and berated them through a hole in the wall. "You've called yourselves a king and prince," he cried, "to try to make me marry your sister, but you are nothing but beggars, not worth the water you drink. I mean to make short work of you, and this sword is being sharpened that will cut off your heads." King of Peacocks, answered the king angrily, you had better take care of what you are about. I'm as good a king as yourself, and I have a splendid kingdom, and robes and crowns, and plenty of good red gold to do what I like with. You are pleased to jest about carving our heads off. Perhaps you should think we have stolen something from you. At first, the king of the peacocks was taken aback by this bold speech, and had half a mind to send them away altogether. But his prime minister declared that it would never do such a trick as to pass unpunished. Everybody would laugh at him. So the accusation was drawn up against them that they were impostors, and that they had promised the king a beautiful princess in marriage, whom, when she had arrived, promised to be an ugly peasant girl. This accusation was read to the prisoners, who cried out that they had spoken the truth, that their sister was indeed a princess more beautiful than they, and that there were some mystery about all this which could not fathom. Therefore they demanded 7 days in which to prove their innocence. The king of peacocks was so angry that he would hardly even grant them this favor. But at last he was persuaded to do so. While all of this was going on at court, let us see what has been happening to the real princess. When the first day broke, she and Frisk were equally astonished at finding themselves alone upon the sea, with no boat and no one to help them. The princess cried and cried, till even the fishes were sorry for her. Alas, she said, the king of the peacocks must have ordered me by throwing me into the sea to have changed his mind, and did not want to marry me. But how strange of him, when I shouldn't have loved him so much, and we should have been so happy together. And she cried even harder than ever, for she could not help still loving him. So for 2 days they floated up and down the sea, wet and shivering with the cold, and so hungry that when the princess saw some oysters, she caught them, and she and Frisk both ate some, though they didn't like them at all. When night came, the princess was so frightened that she said to Frisk, "Oh, do please keep barking for fear the souls should come and eat us up." Now, it happened that they had floated close enough to the shore, where a poor old man, living alone in a little cottage. When he heard Frisk barking, he thought to himself, that must have been a shipwreck. Or, dogs didn't really pass that way by chance. And he went out to see if he could be of any use. He soon saw the princess and Frisk floating up and down, and Rosette, stretching out her hands to him, cried, "Oh, good old man, do save me, or I shall die of cold and hunger." When he heard her cry out so piteously, he was very sorry for her, and ran back into his house to fetch a long boat hook. Then he waded into the water up to his chin, and after nearly drowning once or twice, he at last succeeded in getting a hold of the princess's bed and dragging it to shore. Rosette and Frisk were joyful enough to find themselves once more on dry land, and the princess thanked the old man heartily. Then, wrapping herself up in her blankets, she daintily picked her way up to the cottage in her bare little feet. There the old man lighted a fire of straw, and then drew from an old box his wife's dress and shoes, which the princess put on, and, thus roughly clad, looked as charming as possible, and Frisk danced his very best to amuse her. The old man saw that Rosette must be some great lady, for her bed coverings were all of satin and gold. He begged that she would tell him her history, and she might safely trust him. The princess told him everything, weeping bitterly again at the thought that the king's orders that she should be thrown overboard. "And now, my daughter, what is to be done?" said the old man.
"You are a great princess, accustomed to fare daintily, and I have nothing to offer you but black bread and radishes, which will not suit you at all. Shall I go and tell the King of Peacocks that you are here? If he sees you, he will certainly wish to marry you." "Oh, no," cried Rosette. "He must be wicked, since he tried to drown me. Don't let us tell him. But if you have a little basket to give it to me."
The old man gave her a basket, and tying it around Frisk's neck, she said to him,
"Go and find the best cooking pot in the town and bring its contents to me."
and away went Frisk. And as there is no better dinner cooking in all the town than the king's, he adroitly took the cover off the pot and brought it all contained to the princess.
"Now go back to the pantry and bring the best of everything you find there."
So Frisk went back and filled his baskets with white bread and red wine, and every kind of sweetmeat, until it was almost too heavy for him to carry. When the King of Peacocks wanted his dinner, there was nothing in the pot and nothing in the pantry. All the courtiers looked around one another in dismay, and the king was terribly cross. "Oh, well," said he, "if there is no dinner I cannot dine, but take care that plenty of things are roasted for supper." When the evening came, the princess said to Frisk,
"Go into town and find the best kitchen and bring me all the nicest morsels that are being roasted upon the spit."
Frisk did as he was told, and as he knew no better kitchen than the king's, he went in softly, and when the cook's back was turned, took everything that was on the spit. As it happened, it was all done to a turn, and looked so good that it made him hungry just to see it. He carried his basket to the princess, who at once sent him back to the pantry to bring all the tarts and sugar plums that had been prepared for the king's supper. The king, as he had no dinner, was very hungry and wanted his supper early. But when he asked for it, lo and behold, it was all gone. And he had to go to bed half starved and in a terrible temper. The next day the same thing happened, and the next, so that for 3 days the king got nothing at all to eat. Because just when his dinner was or supper was ready to be served, it mysteriously disappeared. At last the prime minister began to be afraid that the king would be starved to death, maybe. So he resolved to hide himself in some dark corner of the kitchen and never take his eyes off the cooking pot. His surprise was great when he presently saw a little green dog with one ear slip softly into the kitchen, uncover the pot, transfer all of the contents to his basket, and run off. The prime minister followed hastily and tracked him all through town to the cottage of the good old man. Then he ran back to the king and told him that he had found out where all his dinners and suppers had gone. The king, who was very much astonished, said he should like to go and see for himself. So he set off, accompanied by the prime minister and the guard of the archers, and arrived just in time to find the old man and the princess finishing his dinner. The king ordered that they should be seized and bound with ropes, and Frisk also.
"And the little dog, too."
When they were brought back to the palace, some old king was told that, who said, "Today is the last day of the respite granted to those impostors. They shall have their heads cut off at the same time as the stealers of my dinner." Then the old man went down on his knees before the king and begged for time to tell him everything. While he spoke, the king, for the first time, looked attentively at the princess, because he was sorry to see how she cried, and when he heard the old man saying that her name was Rosette, and that she had been treacherously thrown into the sea, he turned head over heels 3 times without stopping. In spite of being quite weak from hunger, and ran to embrace her and untied the ropes which bound her with his own hands, declaring that he loved her with all his heart. Messengers were sent to bring the princes out of prison, and they came very sadly, believing that they were to be executed at once. The nurse and her daughter and the boatman were also brought. As soon as they came in, Rosette ran to embrace her brothers. All the traitors threw themselves down before her and begged for mercy. The king and the princess were so happy that they freely forgave them. And as for the good old man, he was splendidly rewarded, and spent the rest of his days in the palace. The king of peacocks made ample amends to the king and prince for the way in which they had been treated, and did everything in his power to show how sorry he was. The nurse restored to Rosette all her dresses and jewels, and the bushel of gold pieces. The wedding was held at once, and they all lived happily ever after, even to Frisk, who enjoyed the greatest luxury and never had anything worse than a wing of partridge for dinner all the rest of his life. Spoiled little dog. But anyway. Okay, everyone. That is going to be my last story for this evening. I do thank you all for stopping by and listening and lurking and enjoying my random color commentary on the stories. Because princesses, am I right? Honestly, stepmothers, stepsisters, emperors, they're not the brightest people. And, they never have been and probably never will be. But, let's not get political. Yeah, well, it's hard not to get political when you're talking about kings and empresses and whatnot. I do want to, again, thank the anonymous person for the 5 gift subs. That was freaking awesome. And let us see who we can raid. Because I'm sure there's lots of people on right now. It's Friday night. We're feeling alright. Okay, let's see. Who's on? Chinchilla's on. Chesscat's on. Silver's on. If anyone's lurking, you can suggest a raid target if you would like. Because we're just that way. So Evie's on. Sammy's on. Blackjack's on. Index is on. Ooh, lots of people on tonight. Oh, if I was going by what the count looks like, there's only one of you here anyway. But a raid is a raid is a raid is a raid. Nope, doing that. Who do I want to do raid? Let's see. I don't think there's anyone in my usual circle. Well, besides Sammy. Is Necromop still on? Yeah, Necromop's still on. She's trying to get partner right now. I'm lurking in her chat anyway. Excuse me. Let's see. Boom, biddy boom, 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 biddy boom, boom, boom. Skills on. I rated skills. Who was the last person I rated? Last person I rated. Was Reeve. Let's see. Who do I want to raid? Who shall we raid? This is actually doing stuff right now. He's got 5 people. Who's the wizard? I do not know that name. It's not following. Cassie? Don't know them either. Cassie must. Yeah, okay. Papa Penguin's on. He rated Cassie. Okay, shoot. There's Necromama's. I guess she's still on. Yep, Necromama's on. So, I guess we're gonna raid Sam. Yep, that's raid Sam. So, there's raid message for followers. There's the raid. Oh, that's wrong. There's a raid message for subs. And there's the start of the raid. So, let us go raid the kitty cat. I want to thank you all for coming in and listening, lurking, and doing all that wonderful stuff. And I will, if I don't see you beforehand, I'll see you, next Thursday for more Sherlock Holmes. So have a good night, evening, or whatnot. And I will see you in Sammy's. And have a good night.